You know all about podcasting, that's why you're here. You know about the shows you love and the intimate connection it creates when you listen to somebody speaking right into your ear. You know about all the niche auditory rabbit holes you can dive deeply into when you discover a new show. And you probably know how easy it is to create a podcast, to simply get started. It's inexpensive in tech terms, and all the skills you need can be learned quite fast. But you may also have learned that actually making income from a podcast, particularly as a freelancer or a digital nomad, is really hard. To grow it to the point that you can monetize it successfully takes time and consistent work, sometimes even a little bit of luck. And lots of shows never reach commercial viability, even if people produce them as labours of love. So today I wanted to share with you an idea which could be on your radar if you're a freelancer and you know how to create and record an audio show. Why not consider podcasting for someone else? Podcasting as a service. Why should you bother? Well, audio is big news. From Twitter Spaces to Clubhouse, yeah, apparently that's still a thing. Everyone's talking about talking. And podcasting represents the on-demand format of talking as content. I mean, there are so many stats I could hit you with about this. This graph is from the Edison Media Survey and shows that 62% of US consumers have listened to podcasts, but most importantly, that's rising year on year. Every chart relating to podcasting is basically up and to the right, and you won't have to convince businesses of this. This is all easily available media data. What's interesting is that podcasting is growing really fast in emerging markets and niches, and it's really niche demographics that you need to target. You're not going to go out and compete with Joe Rogan or the New York Times, at least certainly not overnight. And you can find your audience online though, just like people have done with written content and every other form. Right now it's all about differentiation. Earthweb.com says there's over 2 million podcasts, so that's one to cater to every community of interest you could imagine. And there's room for yours too, if you can find the right space for it to make it happen. Because audio on demand is infinitely flexible. We love podcasts because they fit the way we live now. And it's the flexibility we want to see in our jobs and lifestyles turned into audio consumption. We're in this era of user control and choice. So while live spaces and chats are obviously very cool, we also want it when and how we want it, on our own schedule and on our own preferred device when we're doing our own thing. We want content dripped into our ears and minds. And apparently nobody reads anymore, which could be bad news for all of us who create content for a living. But I believe it simply challenges us to connect and engage in different ways. And while we all know multitasking is a myth when it comes to productivity, actually it does have its place, because when we use different bits of our brain in parallel, it works. I'm among many people who love to take podcasts and audiobooks out with me on a hike, or if I'm cooking or doing housework. And business and information podcasts in particular are a great way to learn and stay updated on things without having to look at a screen, which we all do far too much of anyway. So the growth of branded business podcasting is hardly surprising. And during the pandemic, it was frequently customer service which truly differentiated relationships with business and helped you relate to brands and distinguish which ones you felt were okay or good or really great. And audio is so intimate, so it really helps customers and clients feel deeply connected with the brands and services they use. It's literally one person speaking into their ear directly, so there's nothing more intimate than that. Podcasting also fits the flexible world that consumers occupy today. And that same idea of consumers as consumers of podcast content for business also applies to employees, the sort of internal consumers, if you like. And in-house podcasts, which create cohesion and support information sharing within enterprises, are another huge growing vertical, especially in our increasingly distributed and hybrid world. Again, it's that intimate connectedness where people talk about losing culture when people are working remotely, and this is just one more tool that means that doesn't have to happen. Audio can instantly create that connectedness when you're literally whispering into their AirPod. And really, it's just more content marketing after all, which businesses have been doing for years, both to communicate internally and externally. But as previously mentioned, reading long articles may be declining along with our attention spans. So blogs might be harder to engage with. Video is more accessible than ever, and for smaller brands it's amazing what you can create in terms of video just using your phone, and it means you can immediately put a face to your words. But once you get beyond the micro enterprise level, lots of brands are wary of video because it can be hard to produce it to professional standards. And then you've got a choice of expensive specialist outsourcing or the risk of looking a tiny bit amateur, and that can put some brands off from getting involved in creating video content. Now, I believe that podcasts and audio content in general can really bridge that gap there, creating rich and engaging multimedia content in a new medium, but without those risks to the brand values and how it might appear if things aren't done optimally. So businesses might want a podcast, but even if they know they might benefit from it, still they might not know where to start, and they might need some external help to get going, and that's where you can come in. The cost of entry is low, but there's still an investment of time, especially if they're not experienced. What software, what hardware do they have to buy, and so on? What steps do you need to take in order to plan and create and actually launch a new show? If you've never done it before, it's quite a steep learning curve, and they might have no obvious resource in-house. So it can make a lot of sense just to shorten that time to market. If they're going to invest in somebody to do it for them, it makes sense to get someone who's already experienced. Also, if a business hires you as a freelancer to produce a podcast for them, it arguably kind of de-risks it for them. The show itself is likely to be hosted externally and syndicated through the podcast players. Well, of course, you very much hope that they're going to put it on their website and leverage their own communication assets. It gives them this sort of CIA-like plausible deniability that if for any reason it doesn't work out, well, they don't want to commit to it long term, it was just a thing that they did, a short-term venture. They haven't had to create a permanent employed position or associate a really senior team member with something that might prove to be a one-off short season of self-contained content. Obviously, we hope that's not going to be the case, but you can also use this concept when you're talking to them about outsourcing it as a de-risking strategy that helps them distance themselves from the whole thing. Hand it over to you and let's just see how it goes. So who are you going to target with this amazing offer of podcasting for a service? Well, I think this is probably one of the most important things to get right. Otherwise, you're not going to get anywhere with it. You need a client business who's of the right size for you. So that can be a tricky one to position. They need to have the budget to do it because you're not going to do it for free. But you're looking for somewhere that's less likely to have the expertise or resource in-house. Not somewhere huge because they'll just hire somebody to produce their podcast, or they'll hire a big agency rather than a freelancer. And you need somewhere that understands content and invests in it already. So ideally they're already thinking about doing a podcast or exploring new media, or they're curious about it. And they also realise that these things have a cost and they have a minimum commitment in order to see results. So maybe you find someone who's got a neglected YouTube channel with some slick corporate stuff but nothing recent. Maybe they've got a great blog where you can see that they truly appreciate the value of hiring great writers. That must be a cost that they budget for. So like all great freelance collaborations, the time that you spend initially on the research and relationship building will pay off over the longer term. And you won't want to pitch this idea to just anyone who isn't a great fit in terms of their readiness and understanding. In fact, finally, I'd say that fit is probably the most important things in terms of your own experience and your knowledge and your personal brand. I mean, yes, there is such a thing as a naive facilitator role, and you could argue that you can do a podcast about anything if you're interviewing people who bring the expertise to it. But as the host, you'll do a much better job of planning and ideating and interviewing if you're deeply embedded in the niche in which your client is operating. Ideally, then you'll bring some audience to the table too, and that will be an important part of your pitch as to why you should be the person hosting it and managing it for them, how you're going to add value by bringing some existing audience. And obviously, this is also a hell of a lot of work. So I really suggest that you only pitch podcast ideas to people who you want to work with long term, where it's a brand that you're passionately aligned with in terms of their values and what they're actually doing, their outputs and activities. So you're not going to end up with a massive list of prospects here. Ideally, you want to hone it right down, and that's fine. I mean, I'm currently flat out doing this for one weekly show. I certainly couldn't cope with another one, not on a weekly basis, and getting that fit right has been the most important thing. So once you've got the business agreed and they're talking to you about doing this, you then need to figure out the show and actually develop a strategy for the podcast that you want to create for them. This stage is really important, and it's not just about how much you're going to pay me to do it. You need to do a bit of the working through and really decide if this is going to be a fit for both of you. The first thing you want to figure out is who they want to talk to and what they want to talk about. That might be obvious, but it might not. So you need to be laser targeted here. Would they benefit from a podcast to talk to their existing customers? Or should they in fact be trying to address their prospective market? Is it more of an industry thing where they want to position themselves as thought leaders with potential collaborators? All of these are going to take slightly different approaches and content strategies. But obviously, whichever route you go down, and you may be able to address more than one audience with the right show or the right kind of combination of content strategy, the main thing that you need to make sure, just like with any piece of content marketing, is how you're going to add value for that audience, not sell to them. So you need to have this alignment where if the brand is going to be the official originator and owner of the content, that has to have credibility and be meaningful, but it also has to tread the fine line of informing and entertaining rather than marketing. So that's the most important thing to pin down. Who do you want to make a podcast for? And are you both agreed on that? The next thing you'll need to discuss, and again get written down as part of your proposal and ultimately your contract, is exactly what you're going to do, what you're going to manage, which bits fall to you and which bits will stay in-house. For example, planning, booking guests. Are you going to agree parameters for that, or will you need to run each potential guest by somebody in-house initially at least? What about the admin of chasing it all down? The hosting and interviewing, the editing, the syndication? Will this be part of a transitional process where you start everything off, but ultimately you train people in-house over time to host it or to produce it and ultimately hand things back? If so, get those timelines pinned down so that you don't end up basically giving away all of your strategy and doing all the upfront work and then hardly doing any episodes. And secondly, also, you don't want it to go the other way as well. If you want a short-term contract and strategic intervention to set them up to do their own thing, but they don't have any real resources or personnel committed to it down the line. So I would say if that's the case and you want some kind of tapered handover, definitely look to get that in writing at this point. So you've got all your deliverables and how long for. Equally clear, I would say it's very important to identify what's not in scope, because if people haven't produced a podcast before, they might assume that people always do this, or the show that they listen to always has that. So if, for example, you're definitely not budgeting for you to run paid ads or for you to do live events or for you to do streaming and so on, get it specified at this point. And it may take some negotiating. Perhaps they haven't got anyone in-house to do the brand social media, and you can actually take that into your contract even if you have to outsource it to someone else. So go backwards and forwards and make sure you come up with a package everyone's happy with. For the Future is Freelance show, for example, they wanted video, which is fine. I'm happy to capture video for them when I conduct the interviews for the podcast, but I have nothing to do with editing or producing the video because I haven't got a clue. So my responsibility is for the audio show, and I capture and provide them with raw video files for them to do whatever they want with. And sometimes I use bits of it to market the audio show, but I don't attempt to produce it as a piece of video content. Next thing you're going to need to pin down in your contract with your client, however much you're doing from them, is what you need from them, because obviously you can't do this in complete isolation. You're probably going to need access to their in-house design people, the graphics people, for example, to create you branded assets for your show. They might have social media accounts, they might have social media people that you need to be liaising with. You might need editorial approval for the content. They might have a massive list of contacts you can hit up as potential guests. They might have a lovely big mailing list that they can send out the links to the show in. All of this is really important, so make sure that you scope it all out in advance. If they're going to host the pod site on their website, for example, or if they're going to embed a player, if the success of what you're doing depends on other people, basically it's really important to get extremely clear on accountability and who's available to do stuff when, because once you get into the cadence of a regular weekly show, you don't want anything to interrupt that, and you don't want to be late with an episode because you're waiting for someone to produce an image or edit a file or something. And particularly when you're the freelancer working with an established employed team, and you're kind of a little bit at a distance, you're on the outside on a guest Slack channel, and you might not have the usual connections or onboarding to know who to ask about different things. So I would definitely build this into the scoping conversation initially and get very clear about who you're going to be working with and how, and that they are committed to work with you to help make this thing a success. And because you're hoping, obviously, to create an ongoing relationship with them. But obviously, most clients understandably won't want to go into an ongoing thing with no lid on it to start with. So I would suggest from both of your points of view that you'll want to agree a minimum package up front, like 6 episodes or 10 episodes. If it's a lower number, then you might want to consider costing out those setup costs initially as a separate project where you plan a load of the content and create visual assets and set up interviews and so on like that. Make that something you do as a pre-launch product on its own, or if they're committed to a lengthy season, you might be able to roll that all up into an episode cost. So you just need to be aware that it might not be a forever thing, and I mean that might be something you want to consider your own exit strategy for as well. Who's going to own the content? What happens about ongoing hosting, for example, if they decide they're not collaborating with you anymore, but you've set all of that up? For that reason, I would strongly advise that if you are doing podcasting on behalf of a client, you set up everything new on new accounts. It makes it much easier to disentangle and hand off rather than if they're on your hosting or your syndication service. It's a lot more messy. A branded email address, in fact, will really help you at this point. It gives you credibility when you're approaching guests as well, but it also makes it extremely easy to keep everything separate when you're dealing with your client channels. I think having this conversation up front helps position you professionally too, and it helps to manage their expectations so they understand the intangibles and the brand building and thought leadership that they're creating with you. Because downloads are going to take time to grow. If you've done anything to do with podcasting before, you know this. So you really want to get their commitment as a team to support you in sharing and engaging and promoting this as a joint venture for mutual benefit. And then, obviously, the secrets of success is just like any other freelance gig. Be great to work with and do an excellent job. For me, as a freelance provider, that means just being a safe pair of hands, being absolutely reliable, not bringing any drama, over-communicating by default so that the client understands everything you're trying to do. There are no surprises and they know what they can do to help. For example, you can draft social media snippets in advance and then ask them to amplify that and send that out. It just saves time if you think through all of it beforehand. You need to invest to do a good job. You need to make sure that you keep up to date with training on the software that you're going to need. If you're editing, it's all important to make everything sound great for your customer so they feel proud to promote your content and grow their audience. You might need to invest in some hardware, a decent mic, though obviously bear in mind and manage expectations because you can't make every interviewee you turn up with a great mic on. So all you can do is create content to try and advise people and what to bring to the table. Above all, being the voice of a brand is a big responsibility. And when you're contacting guests or interacting on social, as well as when you're actually interviewing in a show, it's important to always keep that in mind. Never let up on that responsibility and always understand that your client is effectively taking a risk with you and trusting you. I mean, at first they might want to listen back to every episode, but soon they won't, and they'll be relying on you to make sure that whatever goes out represents them extremely professionally and credibly and well. So if you've ever had a personal or community podcast, then the standards might be slightly different, and it was all on you anyway. So you might need to just rethink your use of language, how you use brand assets, what you're acceptable with visually, and so on. So it's all a negotiation, and it's all just about being professional. Likewise, the actual project management needs to be super slick. And for a weekly show, that is a lot of work. For me, a lot of it's down to process and really streamlining it, getting that workflow right. I use Trello, I use checklists, and I work back from the release date. So if this show goes live on Friday the 17th, I want the interview on the bag on this date, and I want the graphics ready by that date, and the editing and the scheduling has to be done, and so on in a certain order. So all of that needs to be managed and pushed by you until it settles into a rhythm. And consistency really matters. That's part of your professionalism. So what I strongly suggest, I don't always practice what I preach here, believe me, but is try and get a couple of weeks ahead of yourself. And at the very least, create some evergreen, non-time sensitive spare episodes, if you like, which you can keep as a backup. Because you might have something really topical, someone you're desperate to talk to this particular week, but then something goes wrong and you cannot record. And that means it's 3 days to go and you've got no episode ready to go out. So have your backups, have your spare content up your sleeve. And the good thing about that is it also means that you can take breaks as well. You can travel. You can do a lot of this work on the road. Obviously, some parts are easier to do in a predictable location, such as the interviewing itself, where you want a reliable internet connection and you want the best quality acoustic environment you can get. So if you plan it and organise it and batch it, you can still do an awful lot whilst you're travelling and being a lot more nomadic. Just making sure you've got access to a decent audio booth in a co-working or so on. And that you have some flexibility there, because your guests who are probably not getting paid, they're doing it to build their own profile, but for whatever reason, they might mess you around at the last moment. That's just a fact of life. So at the end of the day, it's all about how you manage it and how you add value. And effectively, you're consulting to your clients, helping to make sure that you're promoting their brand and completely aligning with their business objectives at all times. The content you create is about their brand and it's got to be authentic, and you've got to be a great collaborator. If you can get those things right, if you can find the right partner to work with, then you're going to have the perfect flexible gig, which can run and run. And who knows where podcasting as a service might ultimately take you. If this has piqued your interest, then let's continue the conversation. You can screenshot this page or you can find me on the socials. I'm the only Maya Middlemiss out there, so if Google finds it, then it's me. Do check out what I've been creating for solo over at the Future is Freelance podcast. It's available on all your favourite podcast apps, and you can also rate, review and subscribe, and all those things, of course, are really helpful. And if you've got a great story to share with our audience of solopreneurs and freelancers, I'd love to hear from you too. So we'll see you in the AMA. Let's keep talking, because that's what podcasting's all about.